podcast starts at Barley Hall in Coffee Yard just off Stonegate. The podcast is divided into 7 sections with a map at the beginning and end of each to show you where you should be for the beginning of each part. We hope you enjoy the tour and hearing from the people who have lived and worked in this area. Coffee Yard was formerly known as Langton Lane, but was renamed when York's first coffee house opened in the area in about 1670. Mrs. Angela Kathleen Parker, whose father worked for Jackson Signs, a business that had moved from Stonegate to Coffee Yard, recalls the coffee ovens that were found here.
There was a building on your right which there was a flat in it, which is now opposite Barley Hall, and that was privately rented out. And next to us, it was sort of like an L shape, and we were in the long bit. In the shorter bit, there was Noel Wainhouse Electricians. In the part that Noel Wainhouse was in, that actually had the coffee ovens in it.
David Harrison moved to the Coffee Yard in 1971.
I bought the building when it was in a fairly run-down state, as indeed much of Coffee Yard and indeed quite a lot of Central York was still in those days. The downstairs was a charity shop at the time, run by a charity called Minds Matter, and it was one of the first charity shops in York. It was a bit shabby down there, but nonetheless people did come and use it, and a lot of people's reason for coming to Coffee Yard was to go to the charity shop. I know 2 people in York who are now near retirement, who were students living there in the early 60s, and there had been a plan at one time, as there was in York in the 60s, 70s, to pull it down and build a modern building there, but fortunately that didn't take place. See, I think my building, I would date it from about 1675, and I have some very big original timbers inside of that date. I've got one wall which I think is medieval, and other people have tended to agree with me, when it goes all the way down. This below. Upstairs is rather put together of ad hoc timbers. I'm not sure they're all authentically in the right place. And some of the timbers are 20th century that have been put in between just to make it more decorative.
Barley Hall was originally the townhouse of the Augustinian monks from Nostell Priory near Wakefield. The oldest parts of the hall date from about 1360. In 1466, the hall had been leased to a leading York citizen, William Snorsell, goldsmith, Lord Mayor of York, alderman and Member of Parliament, who made it his home. It then continued through history with many different residents until the 1980s, when Orton Plumbers was running its business out of the building which had once had such an illustrious history. The house was bought by York Archaeological Trust in January 1987. Later that year, a full archaeological investigation of the interior was carried out through 1 metre of deposits to the 14th century levels. These initial excavations revealed the remains of the floor of the Great Hall. From 1990 to 91, further excavations looked at the courtyard and found the remains of the exterior stairway to the Great Chamber on the first floor. Work to restore the hall to its former glory began in 1990, and it reopened to the public in 1993. Dr. Peter Addyman was the director of the York Archaeological Trust when Barley Hall was being excavated. He recalls some of the history of the hall and the investigations into the site in the early 1990s.
We were called in one day by Richard Wood. Now, Richard Wood is a well-known entrepreneur in York. His father was a very famous Lord Mayor, Jack Wood, and he'd acquired this old building in Coffee Yard just off Stonegate. He got some architects in to convert it into what were described as prestige offices. So it was going to be a crumbly old building that had a few nice oak beams, but was a rather upmarket modern office. And when we were asked to go in to do some archaeological excavation there prior to the development, I suddenly tumbled to the fact that actually there was more to this building than met the eye. There was most of a large medieval building in there. Behind the plaster, you could see the shape of the timbers and so on. And it was right in the middle of the tourist zone, and it actually fitted the bill for the idea of having a medieval house you could go into. So to cut a very long story short, we managed to persuade Richard Wood very kindly to sell Barley Hall. It wasn't called that in those days. It was called 2 Coffee Yard, I think. to sell 2 Coffee Yard to the York Archaeological Trust simply for what he paid for it. So he didn't lose anything, he didn't make anything on it, and he agreed. He let us do this. So there we were, with this crumbling old heap of all sorts of periods of construction, from 20th century breeze blocks way back to medieval timber work, with all sorts of alterations along the way. And the trust then set about the business of turning it into a, as near as possible, version of what had been there in the Middle Ages.
Although there are many historic buildings that you see in Coffee Yard today, there are also some which have long since disappeared. One former resident of Stonegate, Jill Murray, formerly Jill Knowles, recalled her family's stained glass making business, which was based in Stonegate. Talking of Coffee Yard, she remembered that when her grandfather bought the business, the workrooms were at the back, and next door there were 2 or 3 cottages in Coffee Yard, as today, which came with the house. Then further back, along Coffee Yard and behind Barley Hall, on the right-hand side, was a chapel built in the 1800s, where a couple of people were buried. According to Jill Murray, the chapel eventually got into a terrible state, but Greenwoods, who owned an antique business on Stonegate, used it for storage. Eventually, the chapel was sold to Greenwoods, and they knocked most of it down, but used some of it as a car park. Now proceed through the Snickle Way, away from Stonegate, with Barley Hall's glassed-in hall to your left. You'll emerge from the low passageway into Great Lane. This lane, originally Grope Lane, was a red light district in medieval times. Like Coffee Yard, it was an important area for printing and bookbinding when the first printing press came to York. As you'll see on the left as you walk down Great Lane, Quacks the Printers is still based here today at number 7. The next part of the podcast begins here.